Gemini Man, Section 1, Prisons, Chapter 1. The rainbow never made it to Piatigorsk. 3 colors only were in evidence: the white of the snow, the gray of the sky, the black of the souls and the hearts. No trees or plant life of any kind broke through the crust of the moonscape. No birds with their bright plumage ever appeared in the sky or came to rest on the power lines, the only break in the desolate scene. In fact, the only life of any kind that had ever been seen here was the gray shadows that passed for humanity. The only sounds, the wind, the muffled sob, the anguished scream, the snap of a breaking arm, leg, skull, or frozen power line. This impotent, infertile, icy piece of forgotten ground had a name, a dot, the smallest, on some maps, and little else. Its 4 buildings, the only for over 100 miles in any direction, were run down, haphazardly patched, just waiting for the right wind from the perfect angle to blow them away into oblivion. Into the oblivion they so well deserved. But somehow, each year, Piatigorsk remained a monument to the lunacy of its creators. The helicopter completed its 3rd orbit of the site before its radio crackled to life. CH, this is DB, go ahead please. This is CH, request permission to land. CH, this is DB, state your purpose. DB, this is CH, I have aboard Major Valery Vitenka, personal representative of General Medvedev. The Major carries priority papers from Internal Security Moscow Central. A long silence of crackling static. CH, this is DB, you are clear to land, you will be met. The pilot put down the microphone and turned to the passenger sitting behind him. We've been cleared. When we hit the ground, keep your head down, your faceplate on, and move quickly away from us. The ice chunks the blades will kick up are like bullets. Get inside as quickly as you can. Vitenka zipped up his parka. Aren't you going to shut down? The pilot shook his head. Not here. Engine will freeze up and won't be stuck until spring. We'll be back for you sometime tomorrow, if we're lucky. Vitenka nodded, pulled his Sabeline hood over his head, and gave a thumbs-up sign. The helicopter banked sharply, coming down at a steep angle. It pulled up at the last moment, thudding to a stop on the frozen ground. A crewman slid the door open, and Vitenka jumped out. It seemed like being in the center of an insane blizzard. Snow and ice flew crazily in all directions, forming a solid white wall, obscuring everything within sight. Vitenka felt painful, heavy thumps against his body as he was pelted by the ice. He took a few careful steps forward, desperately trying to pierce the flying whiteness and debris. Looking for the promised reception or guide, he took another step, then was knocked to the ground as something heavy struck the back of his head. He lay there for a full minute as he tried to regain his breath, to somehow get back to his feet. Suddenly, he felt a tug at his arms. He resisted at first instinctively, but then gave in to it. 2 minutes later, the storm, kicked up by the rotor blades of the cargo helicopter, abated. Slowly, Vitenka raised his head. 3 men stood around him. 1 stood on either side, holding onto his arms. The 3rd stood a little bit in front of him, looking down at him. All 3 had their faces obscured by heavy furred parka hoods. The man on either side slowly helped him to his feet. The man in front gestured ahead and to the right. Vitenka fell into step behind him. 5 minutes later, they walked through an open, heavy steel door and into the nearest building. The door was quickly closed and secured behind them. The 4 of them stood in a dark, confined antechamber. Vitenka could barely see the others, but he felt them move and could almost make out the furry shapes around him. After a minute that seemed like 10, an inner door opened, flooding the chamber with light. The men moved through. Parkas were peeled off and carefully hung on nearby racks. The 2 men who had dragged him in He could now see they were a corporal and a private, saluted and left down a dimly lit corridor. The third man, a line sergeant well over 50, looked Vitenka over slowly. "You can hang that thing," he spit out the word with contempt, "over there." Vitenka took off his expensive winter snowsuit, trying to ignore the tone in the man's voice, then turned back to him. "I am Major Vitenka," he began. "I carry priority—" "Whatever," the sergeant said in a disinterested voice. "This way." Vitenka paused, then followed. So far, nothing was as he had anticipated, and for a precise man like Vitenka, nothing could be more disconcerting. The dark corridor was lit by dully flickering orangey bare light bulbs hanging more than 15 meters apart. The result was dim islands of light directly under each bulb, separated by pools of twilight. Vitenka could sense more than see doors every few feet along one side of the corridor, but no light escaped from them. Finally, they came to the end of the corridor and a door marked Director, Custodial Affairs. The sergeant knocked loudly twice, then opened the door. Vitenka had to blink to protect his eyes from the assault of bright light that cascaded from the room. Squinting, he walked through. "Major Vitenka," a short, hard man with an incongruously warm smile said as he came out from behind his desk. "Welcome to Detention Barracks 6210. Vitenka opened his eyes fully, taking in the bright office and the little man at its center. He snapped to attention. Major Valery Vitenka, sir. I carry priority papers from Internal Security, Moscow Central." The man casually returned the salute. "Colonel Igor Ruinov, at your service, Major." He gestured at an overstuffed leather chair in front of the desk. "Please." He returned behind the desk, sitting casually in his large, heavily padded swivel rocker. "You are hell and gone for Moscow Central, Major. What can I do for you?" Vitenka tried to sit at attention in the comfortable lounger, but its soft padding made it very difficult. "Sir, I bring you the personal compliments of Lieutenant General Medvedov." Ruinov shrugged. "A long way to come for that, Major." He casually dropped his hands to his lap. "The General has instructed me to inform you that your work at this facility has not been without notice. He wishes me to express to you his deep satisfaction and gratitude for a job well done." Ruinov was a smiling cipher. Gratifying. Vitenka was put off by the man's seeming indifference. "I assure you, sir, the General is most taken with your record of achievement." He paused, "and if I might add, personally, I took the liberty of reviewing the dossier on this facility before I left. Your accomplishments in maintaining order here are extraordinary by any standards. You should be very pleased." Ruinov studied the man across from him carefully. His insignia showed him to be a military academy graduate with more than 6 but less than 8 years of service. His ribbons were predominantly for conduct and efficiency, none for combat. His hair was precisely 3 centimeters above his collar, 6 above his ears. Service manual perfect. His uniform, new and freshly pressed, had been tailored to give him a perfect fit. In short, he was everything Ruinov hated: rich, pampered, educated, and experienced. "Major, have you ever been to a 62 series detention barracks before?" "No, sir, but I am directly responsible for overseeing their weekly productivity reports and thereby have an intimate knowledge of them." Ruinov nodded in a tired way. "Let me explain to you some of the realities of a 62 barracks which may have escaped your notice." He gestured at the map on the wall behind him. "We are 160 kilometers from the nearest settlement, 161 kilometers of ice storms, gale force winds, and a summer temperature that never rises above -9 degrees Celsius." He paused, pulling a cigar from a desk drawer. He offered it to Vitenka, who shook his head. "We maintain order, Major," he said as he lit up, "because in this quaint piece of hell there is no alternative if the prisoners wish to survive." He exhaled a deep blue cloud of smoke. "They understand this, as does the staff. To create disorder in these conditions is an act of suicide." A silence settled between them. Sir," Vitenka began after midnight, "I carry priority papers from Internal Security, Moscow Central. Brunoff smiled. I feared you'd forgotten all about them. Butenka handed them across the desk. Brunoff broke the seal. Let's see what Moscow Central's priorities are these days. He flipped through the first 2 pages. Fairly routine. He looked up at Butenka. It says you have the full competence of Medvrov in that pack. Butenka pulled himself to an even straighter attention in the soft chair. A 2-inch endorsement, Brunoff said as he continued reading. He stopped midway through the 3rd page. What are these Neftagorsk Accords? Sir, they were signed by President Yeltsin and the American president, I believe, in late 1995. I don't recall hearing anything about it. He paused. Of course, up here, news travels very slowly. Only recently we discovered that man had walked on the moon. He returned to his reading. What is the meat of the thing? In exchange for American loan guarantees for the purchase of American durable goods, the Russian Republic promises to repatriate all American citizens being held in Republic prisons in 3 phases. Brunoff rolled the cigar in his mouth as he continued reading. And they are, first, all status offenders, illegal immigrants, hooligans, and the like. Second, non-political statute offenders such as robbers, rapists, drug dealers. Good riddance. Butenka nodded. It will remove a tremendous burden from our penal systems. Brunoff turned a page. Suddenly he froze. Flipping back and forth between 2 pages, he read and reread several paragraphs. Specials? His voice was low and stunned. It was felt, Butenka said flatly, ignoring Brunoff's tone, that it would be appropriate to include special political prisoners in the 3rd phase. They cost the most to maintain and serve little purpose in this new world order. In this new world order of yours, espionage is not to be punished? Brunoff looked shocked. On the contrary, Butenka said easily, it has been determined that espionage will be punished by a term of imprisonment not to exceed 5 years. We will turn over only those individuals whom we have held for longer than that period. Brunoff returned to his reading. I don't know how many of those He stopped as he turned to the last page. My God. Butenka leaned forward in response to the exclamation. Colonel? Brunoff was turning white, his breath becoming labored. In this cold office, sweat broke out on his forehead. He looked, for all intents and purposes, like a man having a heart attack. Colonel? Brunoff slowly looked up at Butenka. You cannot be serious. There has been a typographical error, transposing of the numbers, something. He paused and continued breathlessly. You cannot be serious. Butenka, a puzzled expression on his face, reached out and took the papers from the colonel. Trying not to stare at the obviously frightened man, he compared the last page to the information he read off his personal memo book. You will transfer to my custody prisoner 90-1368, classification Sigma Theta Alpha, currently in the 6th year of a life sentence. He stopped, then looked up. It is all in order, sir. Brunoff slowly shook his head. It is not in order. Sir? This man, Brunoff began in a hushed tone, 1368, you actually intend to release him? He falls within the terms of the Accords. Butenka had never had orders questioned before and wasn't sure how to deal with it now. No. Excuse me, sir? Brunoff stood up with more speed than Butenka would have thought him capable. He pounded his fist on the desk. You heard me, Major. I will not take the responsibility for unleashing that. His voice trailed off as he struggled for the word. Finally, in exasperation, he repeated himself, I will not accept that responsibility. My apologies, sir, Butenka began slowly, but your orders and your duties are explicitly clear. Brunoff nodded. I quite agree with you, Major. My orders and my duties are clear. Unfortunately, they are also in conflict. Sir, I don't understand. Butenka's expression mirrored his emotions. Pure turmoil. Let me make myself clearer to you, then. He took the papers from the confused major. Before I execute these orders, I am going to damn well confirm them with General Medvedev. Then and only then will I carry them out. He paused, his anger displayed through his savage chewing of his cigar. 1368 will be released only on the express authorization of Medvedev and after my strongest objections have been noted and certified for the record. He chewed through the cigar, pulled it from his mouth, and threw it against the wall. Do you understand me, Major? Vitanka didn't, not even a little bit, but the colonel had their rank, and there was no going anywhere until tomorrow afternoon anyway. Sir, yes, sir, he said as he snapped to attention. Rudolph pressed a button on his desk. A moment later, the line sergeant returned. Yeah, he said. Rudolph walked over to him. Get me General Medvedev on the shortwave, Alexei. It could be difficult, sir. Sunspot activity. I don't give a shit. Get it done, Line Sergeant Nebransky. Nebransky came to attention for the first time. Sir. Vitanka held up a restraining hand before the sergeant could leave. He turned to Ruinoff. Colonel, while you confirm the orders, might I see the prisoner? He used what he hoped was his most charming voice. Ruinoff took several deep breaths. Nebransky, see that the major is escorted to Barracks 3. Nebransky and Ruinoff exchanged significant glances. Do it, Alexei. Ruinoff's voice sounded worn out, exhausted. Nebransky shrugged. Sir. He started out of the office. Vitanka came to attention. And saluted. Ruinoff looked him over for long moments before returning the salute. Vitanka pivoted and started out of the room. Major Vitanka. Vitanka turned back to the colonel. The Americans have a saying, be careful what you wish for because you might actually get it. Ruinoff turned his back as the major left the office. Nebransky was waiting for the major when he came slowly out of the colonel's office. This way, sir, he said casually. He headed off down the dim corridor. Vitanka fell into step alongside. Tell me something, Sergeant. Yes. In confidence, is the colonel a well man? Nebransky chuckled until you came. Almost as an afterthought, he added, Sir. They continued on for 2 minutes in silence. By the way, the sergeant finally asked, which prisoner am I taking you to? 90-1368 Sigma. Nebransky suddenly stopped. You have got to be kidding. Vitanka had reached the end of his patience. This attitude coming from an officer who outranked him was one thing, but this refusal to accommodate his priority orders by an underling was just too much. You will come to attention, Line Sergeant. Vitanka's voice was crisp and authoritative. Nebransky stood there staring at Vitanka as if he lost his damn mind. I ordered you to attention, soldier. If you do not want to face disciplinary actions, you will. He stopped as he heard the distinct snapping sound of a Makarov semi-automatic pistol being cocked. He looked down to see the barrel of the casually held pistol pointing at his groin. Major, Nebransky began slowly, you aren't in Moscow now. Here on the dark side of the moon, we have our own way of doing things, and the smart man learns how to adapt to it. Vitanka stood stock still. He had heard of cases of claustrophobic insanity in the 62 barracks before. The cold, the isolation, the pressure of dealing with the Republic's most dangerous criminals. What do you want, Line Sergeant? He said softly. Nebransky shook his head as if he were dealing with an idiot child. Major, I've been ordered to take you to Barracks 3. I'll do that, But if you want me to take you to 1368, you'd better give me a reason with more teeth than orders. The pressure of the barrel of the gun against Vitenka's pelvis convinced him to do things the sergeant's way. I have orders, he said slowly, to take custody of 1368 and deliver him to the Americans. Bullshit. Vitenka slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his priority papers. He handed them to Nebransky. The last page, Sergeant. Nebransky quickly scanned down the page. As he read, a smile spread across his face. Thank the saints, he muttered under his breath. He lowered the hammer on the gun and holstered it. He clapped Vitenka on the back. Major, you are about to make some men very happy. He started down the corridor, followed a moment later by a very confused Vitenka. Nebransky threw open a door at the end. Sasha, Mikhail, Janos, come with me and bring your weapons. The three men looked up at him from their card game. Why? One of them asked. We're going to pay a call on 1368. The men's faces turned from disinterest to fear. Nebransky shrugged. It might be to say goodbye to the bastard. Reluctantly, they stood up, pulled on their jackets, grabbed their Kalashnikovs, and trooped into the corridor. Halfway out, one of them stopped, turned around, went back in, returning with 3 extra clips of ammunition. Vitenka watched the reluctance, the barely suppressed fear, and shook his head. He followed the men down another dark corridor. Sergeant, he said quietly once he caught up with him, what in the hell is going on here? The colonel acts as if it is an act of treason to release this man, and you all act as if this is second Christmas. Nebransky raised his eyebrows as he directed Vitenka down a flight of stairs. We crossed from building to building underground. It's simpler and a hell of a lot warmer. At the bottom of the stairs, they started through a bone-chillingly cold tunnel reinforced on the sides and ceilings with wooden planks. You're taking him? Nebransky said once they were well into the tunnel. What did they tell you? Vitenka stumbled, braced himself against the wall, then continued on. The soldiers ignored him. He is an American intelligence agent who was captured by internal security forces 6.5 years ago. He received a life sentence and was sent here. As they stepped out of the tunnel, the men paused to warm themselves around a space heater at the foot of another flight of stairs. Typical, Nebransky said. He took off his gloves and warmed his hands. Major, he said without looking up, 1368 is not an intelligence agent. He looked deeply into Vitenka's eyes. He is the fucking devil. He put on his gloves and started up the stairs. Vitenka followed close behind. When he was first brought here, Nebransky said as they climbed, he was under heavy sedation. Our orders were most simple. He was to be held under maximum security, under close detention. We could restrain him, punish him, but under no circumstances could we kill him. When he regained consciousness, he attacked and killed the nurse corporal who was attending him. He also seriously injured 3 guards before he was restrained. He pointed to his left. They were on the 3rd floor now. Steel doors lined both sides of a well-lit corridor. Since that time, Nebransky continued, he has killed 2 more guards, crippled 2 others, and escaped twice. Escaped? Nebransky nodded. The first time we found him passed out on the ice after 4 days and nights of sub-zero freeze. Don't ask me how he survived. I don't ask the devil how he does his tricks. Vitenka saw 2 soldiers standing sentry duty in front of a steel door at the end of the corridor. And the second time, he asked? For the first time, Nebransky seemed shaken. Somehow he crossed the snow plain and made it to the settlement of Kursk. He paused as if reliving a painful memory. He caused the death of a civilian family of 4 and 2 members of local militia forces before we finally caught him up. They stopped 10 feet from the guarded door. Vitenka looked shocked. He was never tried for the murders? Nebransky took a deep breath. 1368 is classified Sigma Theta Alpha, politically sensitive. If the colonel had his way, he would have driven a stake through the man's heart years ago, but Moscow's orders, we couldn't touch him, just restrain him as best as we could and hope he died of natural causes. The men fanned out against the far wall, pointing their rifles at the closed and bolted door. Nebransky signaled for the sentries to join them. The weapons were cocked and held tightly against their shoulders. Nebransky put his hand on the door's heavy bolt. This is 1368. Vitanka held up his hand. The man is sedated now. Nebransky shook his head. We don't have enough for the psycho cases, so we have to ration it. He hesitated. Besides, he's pretty much built up a tolerance to the stuff we got. He pounded on the door with the butt of his pistol. Prisoner 90-1368. You will rise, move to the far wall, and kneel against it. You will cross your legs at the ankles with your hands on your head in plain view. If you are not in this position when the door is open, you will be fired on. Vitanka pointed at the viewing hatch. Aren't you going to check? The man's fear seemed to be contagious. No, I know of a guard who lost his eye that way. He pounded on the door 3 times. The door is opening in 10 seconds. Beads of sweat stood out at the old sergeant's temples as he slowly drew back the bolt. With a last look at Vitanka, he pulled the heavy door. He immediately jumped back, uncocked, and pointed through the door. Vitanka waited a moment until he saw the barest nod from Nebransky. He slowly stepped toward the door. Standing between all those ready to fire rifles and this apparently murderous monster reminded him of an old African saying he had picked up while stationed in Angola. When 2 elephants fight, it is the grass that gets trampled. He peeked around the corner. The man was in the demanded position on his knees, hands on head, ankles crossed. Trying to ignore the taste of sweat on his lips, Vitanka stepped forward. Prisoner 90-1368, I am Major Vitanka of the Russian Republic's Internal Security Apparatus. He said in letter-perfect but accented English, I wish to speak with you. Silence from the man in the baggy prisoner's uniform. Can you hear me? I wish to speak with you. When no answer was forthcoming, he tried again. It is to your advantage to speak with me. Yeah, right, came the monotone reply. Vitanka felt the fear behind him, all those nervous men with twitching fingers on the triggers. Prisoner 90-1368, arrangements have been made for your release and return to America. He paused, waiting for a response that never came. To accomplish this, I must speak with you and obtain confirmation of your identity. Come on in, the man said without moving, still facing the wall. There were no emotions, no intonation at all, that chillingly flat voice. Torn between his growing fear of the prisoner and his natural desire not to be perceived as a coward, Vitanka took a step forward. Major, Nebransky's voice was an urgent whisper. If you step inside, I cannot guarantee your safety. Vitanka looked from Nebransky to the prisoner. Prisoner 90-1368, I am here to arrange your release. Do you understand that? His throat felt dry, and he had a sudden, insatiable need for chilled vodka. I assure you that this is no trick. I mean you no ill will. Then, the man said as he slowly turned his head and looked back over his shoulder, you have nothing to fear in coming in. He turned back to the wall. Long moments passed. Vitanka bit his lips, seemed to hesitate, then walked into the cell. Keep out of the doorway, Major, Nebransky called from the corridor. The cell was 6 feet by 7 feet, barely enough room for the prison cot that lined one wall of the room. A covered bucket that served as sink in the morning, toilet for the rest of the day, stood in the corner. The walls were decaying cement, reinforced with steel bars in a crisscross pattern, a cage within a tomb. Vitanka kept his gaze fixed on the man on the floor. What is your name, prisoner 90-1368? 90-1368 was the atonal reply. If you do not cooperate, your release will be jeopardized. I'm not big on cooperation, but yes, I might be more communicative if I was allowed to stand. He paused. I think much better on my feet. Vitanka steeled himself for the worst. Very well. Major! Line Sergeant, you will not fire as long as a prisoner obeys orders. Do you understand? Nebransky nodded. Some fools could not be saved from themselves no matter how hard you tried. Vitanka turned back to the prisoner. Your movements will remain slow and quite deliberate at all times. Do you understand? My movements are always deliberate, Major. He slowly uncrossed his ankles, lowered his hands, braced himself on the floor, and stood up. He was just under 6 feet tall, thin, under 160 pounds. His chestnut brown hair was streaked with gray and thick. His face was drawn, skin pale, but his eyes burned with an inner fire that shook Vitanka to his core, and they seemed to see everything. Hoping his nervousness didn't show too much, Vitanka smiled at the prisoner. The Russian Republic has seen fit to exercise its mercy upon you. You are to be released. The man stared unblinking at Vitanka. I'm touched. Don't you understand? We are releasing you. You can go home. And all I have to do is... The man's expression was completely blank, as if he didn't have a care in the world about anything, including life. Nothing, I assure you. Merely answer a few simple questions. The man shrugged, causing the soldiers to jump back. Line Sergeant, Vitanka shouted. Sir, I want no accidents. Do you understand me? Sir. Nebransky motioned for his men to stand easy. They didn't, but they did stand easier. Vitanka turned back to the man. My apologies, sir. Now for my questions. You know, the last man who asked me questions left disheartened. Vitanka was pulling his memo book from his pocket. You mean disheartened, sir? As you like. Vitanka looked up into that blank face and burning eyes so suddenly that he dropped his memo book. Before he could react, the man bent down and picked it up. He held it out to the unnerved officer. Slowly, holding his breath with every movement, Vitanka reached forward, taking the book from the man. He quickly opened it, preferring to concentrate on the notes within than to look at the cheerless smile that played at the corners of the man's mouth. What is your name, sir? Brian Newman. And your middle name? David. Vitanka put check marks next to each of the items as he got his answers. Date and place of birth? July 23rd, 1956, Los Angeles, California. Your mother's maiden name? Green Hates. Vitanka looked down the column of identifying information. He had no desire to prolong this any longer than absolutely necessary. Sir, what position did you play on your high school football team? Fullback and middle linebacker. Why? You recruiting for Patrice Lumumba University? Vitanka closed the book and pocketed it. I am satisfied. He looked up at Newman. Would you like me to explain the procedures we will be following for the release? Newman shook his head. Not especially. It'll either happen or it won't. He turned to his left, looking out the door at the nervous guards. I assume they told you about me. Vitanka wasn't sure how to answer that. As it turned out, he didn't have to. They've developed quite a legend around me, you know. He kept his eyes locked on the guards while he talked to Vitanka. They tell you the one about my daring escape to Kursk? He laughed lightly. About how I terrorized the townsfolk? They said, Vitanka began slowly and quietly, that you killed a family and some militiamen. Newman turned back to him. Really? He slowly shook his head. It gets better every time. Do tell me, what's my total body count up to now? They said 9 people. For the first time, an expression crossed the empty face. It was a mixture of amusement and sadness. 9. He said it flatly, as if he were trying to fathom the figure. That's amazing. Unconsciously, Vitanka took a step toward him. Are you saying it is not true? Newman looked up at him. Am I? He turned and walked over to the bed. If we're traveling tomorrow, I should get my rest. He paused. It will be tomorrow, won't it? Barring the unforeseen, yes. He turned and stepped toward the door. I will return in the morning to discuss the details. He stepped out of the cell. Nebransky quickly holstered his gun, stepping forward to close the door. Line Sergeant Nebransky. Nebransky stopped as the cold voice floated out to him from the cell. He turned to look inside. Newman was smiling warmly at him, but there was no warmth in his voice. You shouldn't tell stories out of school. Don't you know what happens to bad little boys who make things up? Shaking, Nabronsky slammed the door shut and quickly threw the bolt. The next morning, Vitenka was summoned to Ruanov's office immediately after breakfast. So, the colonel began without preliminaries. What did you think of 1368? Vitenka thought many things about how men isolated from civilization must find a scapegoat to blame their conditions on, about how easy it is for the simplest event to be blown up into the most horrific, about how naive and superstitious most Russian soldiers still were. He said, "He seems to have held up well." Ruanov stroked his beard. "Then you still intend to release him?" "Yes." Ruanov paused before responding. "It seems," he finally said, "that General Medvedev agrees with you. I just got off the radio with him." "And?" Ruanov held up his hands in a gesture of futility. "He refuses to see. There was nothing I could do but lodge my objections." The man looked as if he were in pain. "Colonel Ruanov, if it would not be presumptuous, may I ask you a personal question?" Ruanov nodded. "Sir," Vitenka began, "if you consider this man such a threat, if you think he is that dangerous..." "I do not think it, Major, I know it." "Then, sir, with respect, why object to his leaving? Why not just let the Americans deal with him?" Ruanov stood up and started pacing in the tiny office. "When I was a boy, I lived in a small village on the Don. One day, when I was out hunting with my older brother, we came across a dog that was foaming at the mouth. It didn't see us, just crossed the road and wandered into a field. My brother said we should go after it, kill it before it hurt someone, but I wanted to continue our hunt. I said it was someone else's dog, it was their responsibility. We continued our hunt. The next day, I heard that the dog attacked and killed a young child." He stopped, turning to face the younger officer. "For over 6 years, I have sat behind this desk and watched 1368. The analogy to the rabid dog is, in my opinion, tame, is a cold, calculating killer. Here we have him under at least some control. To let him loose on an unsuspecting public is something I cannot willingly do." Vitenka stood up. "But surely, sir, your analogy is flawed. If Newman is a killer, then he killed in patriotic duty, to carry out his missions, then in attempts to escape. There is no reason to believe that he represents any threat to his own countrymen, all of that assuming that he is, in fact, a killer." "You have doubts?" "I have, well, questions." Ruanov stepped back behind the desk. "I do not." He pulled some papers from his desk and quickly signed them. "Fortunately, it is not up to us to make this decision." He handed the papers to Vitenka. "I only pray that you're right. I'll order him prepared." Several hours later, Vitenka watched while a detachment of prisoners swept the helipad clean of snow, ice, and debris. 20 minutes later, Ruanov joined him. "They just called. They're bringing him down now." "Good," Vitenka said. "The helicopter is due any minute now. The sound of metal caused them to turn, looking behind them. Newman, surrounded by 5 guards, stood in the doorway to the main building. A thick leather belt ran around the waist of his parka. Connected to it were 5 chains. One each ran 2 shackles around his ankles and wrists, the 5th to a heavy leather collar around his neck, forcing him to walk in a hunched position. In addition, handcuffs held his wrists and legs close together. It would be so easy, Ruanov thought as he looked at the demon that plagued his dreams. So easy. He thought about reaching out as the prisoner shuffled by. The gentlest touch would topple him over in the ankle-deep snow. In the pile, with all the restrictive shackles, a broken neck could be made out to be an understandably unfortunate accident, a thing easily explained to Moscow, to the Americans, and to Ruanov's God. Newman stopped less than a foot past the silent colonel. He turned, looked at the short, combat-hardened former commando, then he smiled. "You'll never get a better chance, Igor," Newman said, with just a hint of a smile. Ruanov stared into those burning, challenging, mocking eyes. Then he slowly lowered his hand to his sidearm. The butt of the powerful automatic slid effortlessly into his palm. At that moment, the helicopter flashed overhead. 5 minutes later, it was idling its engines on the ground. Newman sighed, then shook his head and chuckled at some private joke. Runoff watched as 3 armed soldiers climbed down and helped Vitinka and the guards load Newman into the back of the chopper. After checking that Newman was secured, Vitinka returned to the colonel. Runoff was yelling into the ear of a junior officer who had just come running up. He turned when Vitinka approached. "Goodbye, sir. On behalf of General Medvedev, I want to thank you for your cooperation." Runoff was white-faced. "Nabronsky is dead," he said sadly. "What?" "They just found his body at the foot of a flight of stairs." Vitinka's head was spinning. "He slipped. The stairs were icy. I myself almost..." Runoff was ignoring him, staring instead at Newman in the helicopter. "Take the bastard," he mumbled. "Take him far away." He turned to start back to the building. "Before he turns my command into an abattoir." Vitinka watched the old man go, then slowly turned to the helicopter. Newman, half leaning out the door, shrugged and raised his eyebrows. The cold that swept through the young officer from Moscow had nothing to do with the gathering storm.